Oh, okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back at JFocus again. In this session, we're going to talk about Vue.js and dig into some live coding, look at some examples, and discuss the framework in general. Before I get started, though, I'd like to ask a quick question. How many people are building web apps with Angular? Let's see a show of hands. Wow. Okay. How about React? That's the other half. How many people are using Vue? Oh, that's good. Why are you here? If you already know Vue, you're just going to be bored. It's fine. How many people are just using like Vanilla.js or some craptastic homegrown framework? Anybody? Okay, yeah, there's usually a few. So, all right. So before I get started, if you're interested in diving deeper into Vue, VueConf US is coming up, and it is in Tampa in March. And I can guarantee you one thing, it'll be a lot warmer in Tampa than it will be here. So it's worth the trip if you ask me, okay? My name is Pratik Patel. I work at IBM doing a number of different things. And I'm just going to jump straight into the presentation. So first, what I'd like to do is spend a few minutes talking about just why Vue.js compared to Angular, React, or whatever you might be using, okay? And then we'll do some demos. And if you have any questions while I'm going through, especially the code, and you want to just try something, or maybe you don't understand how something works, please ask a question whenever you have a question, okay? All right, so why Vue.js? This is a great question because there's a lot of frameworks out there and there seems to be a lot of momentum already behind Angular and React, right? When I took a quick survey in here about, the room was roughly split half and half between those two. We had some Vue people here as well, which is great. So one of the reasons I really like Vue is that it has a very low learning curve. Okay, compared to Angular or compared to React, the learning curve is actually quite low, and you actually don't need any tooling. In the first example that you'll see me demo, basically it's just a web page. It's just an HTML page, right? I don't have to have Webpack and all these other things to be able to build, or at least get started with the Vue application. And the Vue people describe Vue as being a progressive framework. So what that means is that you can start literally with just a web page and a script linked to the Vue library, and that's it. And then as you need more stuff, right, as your web application gets a little bit more complex, has more features and things, you can add in Vue Router. And then when you are doing even more with Vue, you can add in state management with Vuex, which is the prescribed state management library. And there's also a large ecosystem of UI widgets and other things like that. If we have a chance, we'll look at Vuetify, for example, which is a material design implementation that runs very nicely in Vue. Okay? And the main reason I really like Vue is that the framework is very intuitive. You don't have to really, basically you can spend about 5 minutes reading the docs or 50 minutes here with me, and you know pretty much everything you need to know to build a Vue application, which is great. And as you're working through it, you'll find that things just kind of make sense. Things are intuitive, and when you think, oh, how do I like cache a property or something, right? Or cache a value, you use computed properties. It's very straightforward, and the conventions are natural, which is very nice. The other thing that's interesting about Vue is that you probably know that Angular is backed by Angular is backed by Google, React is backed by Facebook. Vue is 100% community driven, and there's not like a large company that's behind the framework. So as people in the community, developers in the community need features, they can obviously submit because Vue is open source, or the community looks at, or the Vue core team looks at different features which are needed by the developer community, and they implement them. So it's 100% community driven. Currently, Vue 2 doesn't support TypeScript, but the next major release of Vue, which is coming out sometime this spring, Vue version 3 is going to support TypeScript as well, right? And again, that's something that was driven by the community. How many people build in TypeScript? Probably all the Angular people. How many people like TypeScript? Okay, we're going to need to have words a bit later, but that's a different story, okay? I'm not a big fan of TypeScript. I like me some pure JavaScript, so, all right. So let's do some live coding, and hopefully the demo gods are nice to us today. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into my editor, and of course, it helps if you have the project open, right? All right, so we're just going to do this. All right. Sorry about that. I thought I already had this open. All right. So again, when we want to use Vue, when we're getting started with it, you don't need Webpack. You don't need any tooling. You don't need NPM scripts. You don't need any of that stuff. In this simple example, you can see what I'm doing is I'm just pulling in the Vue core library like so. And I also have Axios in here for doing a network call. We'll get to that later if we have a little bit of time. Okay? So let's pull up our simplest example here, which is 0.html. And let's make sure that I have it open in a web browser window. Okay, so there it's open right there. And first thing you need to know is that inside of the script tag, you have to initialize the Vue library by doing this. And you have to tell it where you want to mount Vue into the HTML. So you can see I have element hashtag app, and if I come into here, you see I have a div called app. Okay, so that's where Vue will get mounted. Now, one of the interesting things about Vue is that unlike React, at least, you don't use JSX, you don't mix your HTML and JavaScript together. You actually just code in straight JavaScript and CSS and HTML. Okay, so what we have here, we would describe in Vue as a template. Right? So this is our template contained within this root div tag called app. And inside of this template, I just have standard HTML. But you can see right here, I have h1 v-html equals greeting. And if we come down into here, into our data element, you can see I have some property called greeting. So we're not at devox anymore, we're at jfocus. So let's go save that, and let's go reload that. You can see that it says hello jfocus. And let's get this right, it's not 2018 anymore, it's 2019, okay? So we're using v-html here, right? And that does a property substitution from here into here. Pretty straightforward. Now, the other way that we can go and fill out a template is, rather than using a directive, using expressions. So v-html is what we would call a Vue directive. Here, I have what appears to be a double curly brace, and inside of that, I actually have some code, just date.toString, okay? And if you're wondering where the date comes from, it comes from right here, okay? And you can see I just have basically a JavaScript expression in here. But this is expression syntax for going and substituting into the template. All right? Now, let's get back to this v-html for a second. If I come in here and I do v-text, and then I reload this, you'll see that it looks like this. Okay? So we have a couple of different directives that we can use to do basic substitution. When I do a v-text, it means just do a raw substitution inside of it. If I do v-html, instead of going and changing the content of that specific tag, a v-html goes and appends something into the DOM, right? So that's the difference between v-html and v-text. V-text just goes and puts it as the text that would appear there. V-html goes and creates a new DOM element that gets inserted at that point inside of our HTML and into our DOM tree. All right, so that's pretty straightforward there. Let's look at a couple more directives here quickly. So I have v-if equals time is greater than 17. Okay, so if it's past 5 o'clock, it's time for beer, otherwise it's time for lunch. And you can see that currently it says time for lunch over here. And I have the time here, I don't know why that's not formatted properly, well, whatever, right? And here's my time property. So if I come into here and say make that 18 and then reload that, it'll say time for beer. But what we've done is we basically put a conditional directly into our HTML template with v-if. So I say v-if, time is greater than that, v-else, if it's not, run this. It's standard if-else statement, right? And of course, we can do else if we wanted to, et cetera, et cetera. It supports all the basic constructs that you would expect in terms of conditionals here. All right, so let's look at a slightly more complex example. All right, so let's open this one up. All right, so let's make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. All right, so inside of this application, I have a couple of extra things that I want to talk about. So far, I've only talked about HTML and how we do template substitution or fill out a template. How do you work with styles inside of Vue? Well, what we do is we use something called v-bind. Again, this is a directive specifically against a style. And you can see that I'm saying color, app color name, top of 100. Right? Now, where's this app color name coming from? If I scroll to the bottom of this, you can have a section inside of your Vue application or inside of your Vue component where you can declare styles. And there are two different ways of declaring styles. In this case, I've said the style is scoped. That means the style is limited to basically just this element, right? It's contained within this element. And this is one of the nice things about doing component-oriented programming inside of Vue, is that you have everything that a component that you use to build a component can be inside of a single file. So you don't have to jump around between different files. You have your template at the top, you write your JavaScript and other things inside of here, and then you can have your styles also directly inside of this one file, right? So when you're building components, you can keep everything together and you don't have to jump around between files, and it's nice and cohesive. All right, so let's look at this app color name. Let's go find where that is, right? And you can see that actually in this case, I've declared the style directly inside of JavaScript. So I have a couple of different options in terms of styles on top of this. I can go and create them in JavaScript and pass it as a JavaScript object, or I can reference a style like so and use that inside of our application like standard CSS. Okay? So let's have a look at one more thing here. All right, so let's go back to this. All right, I have a little button here called toggle logo. Okay, so if I hit that, you'll see that the logo will show and unshow. So how do we do this? Right? A couple of different ways we could have done this. Where's our logo at? Right here. Here's our toggle logo. And in Vue, when we want to go and capture an event, we use another directive called Vdash on. In this case, I'm saying when the on click, right, go and invoke this method called toggle logo. And if I go down and find that method or function, since this is JavaScript, you can see all this function is doing is it's saying this dot show logo, not this dot show logo. It's just a simple toggle, right? Turns it on or switches, flips it from true to false and back whenever the button is clicked. Now, where is this show logo? That, again, is up here inside of our data declaration, okay? So we haven't really talked about the data declaration or what the parts of a instantiated Vue component is, but you can probably guess by now that data is where you put your data, right? We have other things like filters and methods as part of our Vue application, and if we have time, we'll look at computed properties and a few other things, okay? But here's our method for toggle logo. It uses a data element called show logo, and to be able to reference that, we do need to do a this to get a handle to it, right? So the show logo lives in the this object inside of the Vue object, right? So when I click this, it's going to toggle the logo. How's that magic actually working? Right, so if we go here to where the image is, you can see I just have a standard Vdash if. If show logo is equal to true, right, go and show the logo. And there are a couple of different ways that we could have done this. Okay? So there are a couple of other directives, right? Or there's another way that we could have done this. In this case, what I've done is I've used a Vdash if to go and show the logo whenever it's true. In the example above, that's why there are two of these things right here, right? There are two logos. In the first one, what I do is I actually use classes to go and hide the logo, right? So I say, set the class, hide, not show logo. So, and if we go look at what hide is, you can see what it is. It's basically just a CSS class that says display none, right? So when you have a display none, it means that the HTML in that DOM element will not be shown. So we basically just toggle hide inside of here to do this one. And for the second way that we can toggle something, we just do a Vdash if, which will essentially go and show it or not show it in the HTML. Right? So there's something else that we can talk about here, actually. Now, if we go into, for example, our greeting, we have Vdash HTML here. One thing that we could add here is we could also do what's called a Vdash once. And what this does is this basically tells Vue that whatever we're putting into here, just render when you initialize and not keep a track of the property, okay? So if I were to put Vdash once in here and I were to change the greeting at runtime later, it would not get updated, right? And why is this useful? When you're building a Vue application or any web application, you don't want to have too many hooks into different parts of the data because that slows your app down, right? Vue is what we would consider to be a reactive framework. So when you change a property, it has two-way binding like Angular does. Okay, if you're working in the Angular world, you're familiar with that. React uses one-way data flow. Angular uses two-way binding. Vue is more like Angular in terms of that it allows you to do two-way data binding and not have to do all the plumbing around it, which is nice. Okay, but getting back to this Vdash once here, the reason why this is good is because it's essentially a performance enhancement that you can make as a developer. You say, I only need to show the greeting once, it's never going to change, but I do want it to be generated from something inside of my Vue application. But I'm never going to change it again. Right? By putting Vdash once here, we put less of a burden on the framework to keep track of that greeting parameter, that greeting data element. Okay? So when we do that, Vue basically says, I'm just going to render this on the first time, and then I'm not going to keep track of it. So the less things you keep track of in terms of bits of data that you may update inside of your template or component, the less overhead that Vue has to go and keep track of, and your app will run a little bit faster. Okay? All right. So let's see if there's anything else we want to talk about here. So we talked about Vdash if. Yeah, we haven't talked about this loop yet. So there's a basic looping construct available. So if we go look at the output here really quickly, you'll see that there's just a list of links here. And those links are over here. And so I say v-for URL in URLs. And again, the URL's data element is here, right? It's basically just a JavaScript object with 3 properties or 3 URLs in it. And then I go and render that like so. So I say v-for URL in the data holder URLs, set the href, and then just show it here. Okay? So that's how we do a standard for loop inside of a Vue application. All right, let's double check and make sure we've covered everything. I think we have. Let's move on to the next example. All right. So let's look at a basic form for a few minutes and see how this kind of works. Okay? All right, so you can see in this case, I set the Vdash once here on the heading HTML right here. And then I have, if I go flip here, you can see that this is nothing really too crazy. It just has some names and blah, 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 right? Let's make sure this works. Okay, and we'll set the track to be, I don't know, web or something like that. Right, but you can see as I made changes here, the output at the bottom changed. Okay, so this is again where the reactive part or the two-way data binding part of Vue comes into play. Let's see how that actually manifests itself. So we have our Vdash once here. Here's our name, type, et cetera, right? We have a new directive here called Vdash model, right? So Vdash model is used specifically for building things like forms, right? And Vdash model is also the thing that gives you that two-way data binding. When we just do Vdash text or Vdash HTML, that's only one way because we're just showing something, right? We don't have an input field or whatever. A Vdash model actually sets up a two-way data binding from the input field back to the data element in our data. Right, so let's go look at what our data actually looks like really quickly. Okay, so you can see I just have it as just data in here. There's name, presenter email, talk title, track, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I could have put this inside of a sub-object if I wanted to group everything together, but in this case I just threw it directly as part of the data block inside of this little Vue application. Okay, so again, we just have an input. We use Vdash model. Vdash model for all these different things, and that's what gives us the reactivity that Vue provides in terms of the two-way data binding. All right? So let's do something a little bit more complex now. And you can see I have some styles and everything here. Right? Oops. Wrong one. Okay, so let's look at this one right here. Right now, how do we go and actually do something with this data when the user clicks submit? Right? So again, we do a Vdash on click. We're going to invoke the process data method, which is down here. Okay? And the way that we get a hold of those data elements, again, because we're living inside of the Vue object when we're writing this method, we have to prepend our data with a this. So we have this.name and this.presenter email. And again, we have Vdash on click, go and invoke process data, which is this method right here. And in this case, I'm just basically just printing it out to the console. But of course, we would want to do a server call. And if we have a little bit of time, we'll roll Axios into this and make a call to the server. Now, one thing that's interesting is that Vue doesn't actually come with a library to make AJAX calls. Right? You have to use something, and most people in the Vue world use Axios, which is just a library for making calls to some endpoint server. Okay? All right. Let's open up. Let's see what we have in 5.html. This will get more interesting. Actually, we may jump ahead a little bit since this is a slightly shorter talk time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into a more sophisticated project, and let's have a quick look at that, right? So, yes, you could build everything with just a standard HTML file, pull in Vue like so, and like start playing around with it. But when you get ready to build a real application, you probably want some tooling to help you. Because if you noticed, as I made some changes in here, right, so if I say first name, last name, whatever, I'm just going to make some change here. And then I go back to my HTML file, right, it doesn't like show that change immediately. Now, if I reload this, though, we'll get our first name, last name, okay? That's not how we work nowadays in the web world. We used to do that 10 years ago. But now what we do is we have tooling that when you write code, you just hit save and it automatically just shows up as in the web browser as part of your development workflow. So what you can do in Vue is you can go and run Vue and give it some parameters. I'm not going to do this because I don't want to destroy this project. But you can basically say, go and create a new template project, and it'll give you some options in terms of what template you want to use. And in this one, I'm just using the standard Vue-router template project. Right, so let's go open this guy up. Okay. Vue with router. And let's have a look around and see how this project is structured. All right. So if we zoom into here, nothing too crazy here. We have something for a unit test here, right? We can look at the unit test. People typically use Jest to do unit testing in the Vue world, but you can use whatever you want. Some people use something like Cypress.io, which is a really nice tool for doing more extensive testing, more sophisticated testing. And of course, here's my Node modules project where this project has pulled in the entire internet. Have you ever seen, like, let's just do this real quick. This is a really simple project. I'm just curious. Let's see how big our Node modules project is. Oh, it's only 209 megabytes. So I have no idea what's in there. All right, so let's go look at this project quickly. Right. And let me make sure I have this running. Right. Let's go start this up. Webpack will take a little while to go and build and initialize everything. Well, that was fast. Took longer this morning. Okay. Here's our Vue demo here. And let's go play around with this a little bit to understand some additional concepts, including components inside of Vue. All right, so here's our app.js, or app.vue. And here's our main, right? So our main is our initial entry point. And again, this is the Vue router project, so there's a little bit of routing going on. We'll look at the router in just a second. We'll go look at our base component called app now. But you can see we say declare the components, an app, which template to use. That's the one, the app. Okay, so let's go open that up. And you can see now, instead of having like straight HTML, well, instead of having like the HTML tag in here, we have a template tag. And then inside of our script, we have export default app, and we still have styles in here, right? So the difference between the way a Vue component works or looks and structured is just slightly different, right? We have a template, and we have to have a little bit of exports, and we have to new these things up, and we'll get into this in just a second when we look at some more code here, okay? So we have this app here, and there's our logo. What are we showing in the logo? Where is this? All right, so there's our logo. And let's go into components, and let's go look at hello world.vue. Okay. So, and let's actually play around with this Vdash once here. Right. Give me just a second. I'm going to flip back to this. We'll talk about the router in a minute as well, but let's look at the component first. Yeah, that's not going to work because I screwed something up, right? Where's my import? Here it is. Okay. All right, there we go. All right, so let's go into here really quickly. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to orient my screen so I have my editor right next to. Okay. Put this here and put that there. We'll just put it off to the side. There we go. Just so we can see it while we're working on it. All right. So let's go and change the time. It's not good morning now. So we'll come into here. And where is our date? Get hours. Actually, it will work. But let's look at this Vdash once here really quickly. Let's make sure that, let's make sure first that we get like that fast development workflow here. So we'll just say hello world, and I'll save it, and that should appear right there. Okay, so you see that just showed up here. Right, so all I did was just type something in, hit save, and because we have the tooling running in the background here, it will go and push changes live into the web browser. So it makes for a nice development workflow. You don't have to keep hitting reload. When I'm at home on my monitor, I have an editor on one side like here, and then I have the web browser open on the other side so I can get that really fast developer velocity and workflow. Okay, so let's get rid of this because we don't need that. That should disappear right there. Now, previously I talked about how Vdash once only shows the message the initial time and not over and over again. So let's go change this message, right? Right, so you can see this says that this will never change, and let's go fix this. We're not Oracle Code 1 anymore. So let's see where we have Oracle Code 1. Welcome to the Oracle Code 1, blah, 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 whatever. So welcome to JFocus. Let's go save that, right? And, oh, that's interesting. Both of them changed this time. That's not right. That should not have changed. Okay, I'll come back to that. I know why this is. It's because our development tooling is injecting it even though we don't want it to show or change. Our development tooling is going and inserting it. But if we were to do this as a real production app, this would not change, okay? It's our tooling that's doing it in this case, not Vue itself. All right, so let's look around this component a little bit more. Let's make this bigger, okay? See what we have here, right? So we have our data segment here, and this is the part that we have to be a little bit careful of when we switch from just using standard single page Vue application or single HTML file application to components. You can see that compared to what we had before, right? So if we go look at this, and for example, go look at what the Vue application looks like, you can see we just did a new view here, and then we have our data element like so, and it's just defined as more or less a static object, right? When we create a component in Vue, however, what we need to do is we're going to export default this, so of course this is using EF6, but you can see that the data itself is what looks like is a function invocation, and it's returning something, right? So why do we have to do this in a component where we new up our data and the other things that are going to be inside of this, as opposed to just having a static object like so? And the reason for that is actually quite straightforward. When you're building a component, there's a possibility that you will have multiple copies of the component. So each copy of the component should have its own data. And that's why when we write this, we say execute the data method and return this value, or the values that are contained within it, so that each instantiated component has its own value, or its own set of data inside of it, okay? Because we can create multiple versions of the same component, or multiple instances to be specific, okay? All right, so we have some styles here, and let's go and actually look at slightly more complex examples. So I'm gonna go to the router, and this is actually a good time to talk about the routing. Right, so this is the standard Vue router. Again, you don't have to have this in your application, but eventually you'll probably want some kind of URI routing. I think everyone is probably familiar with what URI routing inside of a single page application is, right? It allows you to go and change the URI and load different components, or different views, if you will, based on where you want, or where the user wants to go within your application, and map it to the URI. So let's go change this back to our Hello World 2. Okay, save that, and we should have a slightly different thing coming up here. Okay, so if we go to Hello World 2 now, let's have a look at this. This is more or less the same as what we had before, right? So this is our Vdash if, else, etc. But what I want to show in this one is how do we go and load some data, right? What's like, where do we put a data load inside of our Vue application or Vue component, okay? And so what we do is we hook into one of the lifecycle methods here. And in this case, I'm hooking into mounted. So that means that when the component is mounted, this block of code will get run. And you can see I'm using Axios here, and I'm going and hitting a serverless application that I have running on IBM Cloud Functions. That's just returning like hello world, essentially. But if I reload this, or let's just make a change here. All right, I'm just going to make a small change. And you can see that for a second there, it will say loading data. Let's make this a little smaller. Okay, I'm just going to get rid of that space there. Right? And if you watch right here, you'll see that that will change loading data, and then once it hits that thing, it comes back and fills in that data, right? Let's go look at exactly where that's happening. Okay, so I say this.message, result.data.message. That's part of the Axios HTTP call that I'm making here, which is just a get against a serverless application I have running on IBM Cloud. And the original message was loading data ... right? So if we reload this, you'll see loading data ... and it takes like a second or two to go and grab that and fill it in, okay? And everything else here in terms of that specific network call is pretty straightforward. You can see I just have a H1, and I decided to use expression syntax for substitution instead of a Vdash HTML or a Vdash text, okay? Here's our mounted. That goes and hits the message, which initially is set to this, and that will eventually make its way into here once our network call has been executed, okay? All right, so I've been talking like really fast for the last 30 minutes, so I'm gonna take a quick break and pause for some questions. Is there something we want to try? Something that, like, basically we've covered everything you need to know, well, not everything, pretty much everything that you need to know in terms of how do we start with and build a Vue application, okay? So is there any questions, comments, concerns? Everyone's sold, everyone's gonna dump their Angular and React projects and start using Vue tomorrow, right? Okay, good. I see lots of head shaking yes, so I'll take that as a yes, okay? Any questions, comments? Do we want to try something? No? Okay. Again, if you have any questions, ask them at any time. Happy to answer them. Oh, did they finish really early, or am I running late? Okay. I'm just making sure. I'm like, oh no, we have lots to cover still. Okay. So let me do this. Let me get back to our slideware and make sure that we've covered everything first. Right, so we looked at a standard Vue app. Vue app can all be in one file, right? That's the structure. Normally we split things into components, which I showed briefly. Right? The way this works, we have a Vue instance. We have a template, and inside of that template, we saw things like data and methods, and we can look at filters and computed properties in a few minutes. The data property, it's worth noting that, and this is a common question, is what happens if I wish to change or add to the data object that I have in my Vue component at runtime, right? So the short answer is you cannot change the structure of the Vue data at runtime. You can't go and say, well, I want to add this property at runtime. You have to do it at development time. So the way that we think about this in the Vue world is that what's in the data object is our schema for that Vue component that we're building. And we cannot alter that schema at runtime, okay? And at runtime, that schema becomes our model. But again, you can't go and change it, and that is actually by design and not like a limitation, actually, okay? Because we don't want to go and dynamically change our schema at runtime. Part of the reason for that is around performance and how Vue takes our data and creates two-way data bindings and is reactive and things like that, okay? So, of course, you can modify existing properties, but you cannot add or remove properties at runtime, okay? Because it's our schema. If we don't know what's in our component when we're building it, a little bit of a problem, right? So we looked at this already. Data props can only be primitives, number strings, dates, arrays, etc., right? You can have certain kinds of objects in there, but They can be collections of objects, but not like raw objects. All right, we looked at binding. We can bind data to content. We can bind data to HTML attributes, semantic binding using curly braces, or declarative binding using something like Vdash text or Vdash HTML. All right, so we looked at that. And we can have expressions inside of our semantic bindings. Right? Expressions are something that return a value and that you can use in a Vue template. We also talked about how bindings are two-way and reactive. How does it work? Magic, right? We talked about Vdash once for values that don't need to change at runtime. And again, the reason why we have this and why we would want to use this is that it gives us a little bit of a performance boost because that's less stuff that the Vue framework has to track at runtime. Okay? And we tried to do that, but it didn't work because of our tooling. Only renders once, improves performance. Now, one thing to note about Vdash HTML is you have to be a little bit careful about this because it is literally going and inserting something into the DOM at that point without doing any kind of security checking. We go and directly update the inner HTML to insert that raw HTML there. So there's a possibility that something malicious might make its way there, so you have to be careful in terms of going and injecting raw HTML into the browser, right? So someone could break into your application, into your code base, and rickroll all your users or something, okay? You have to be careful of that, right? We typically don't nest bindings within Vdash HTML, right? Because we're going and directly changing the inner, inner HTML, right? So for binding attributes, we looked at this briefly as well. Right? Actually, we didn't look at this specific example, but for example, if you want to bind the href to something in data, we say Vdash bind href, or most people use the shorthand where we don't have Vdash bind, we just say :href, and Vue knows that you're doing a Vdash bind :href, right? So it's just a little bit of extra typing you can save. We've looked at some directives already, but let's make sure that we have covered everything. Directives can also take arguments and can also take modifiers. We've seen that briefly. Right? So the modifiers we haven't looked at, but we did look at some of the data elements here. One thing that we could do, for example, is if you remember, we did a Vdash on : submit to go and invoke something inside of the little example that we had with the form. Right? What we can do is we can attach what's called a modifier to that thing. And in this case, that's a .prevent. So what .prevent does is it prevents the event from propagating through the rest of the DOM, right? It basically stops it there, okay? And there are a number of different things we could do. So we looked at the syntax for Vdash on, or for binding attributes. For binding other things in Vdash on, we can use @click, right? So some of the other ones, attributes that we used, we could do a shorthand for Vdash bind with : for events or Vdash on, we can do @ instead of having that full syntax there, okay? And we looked at CSS binding a little bit, but let's look at how CSS can be bound in a little bit more detail. So we looked at this specific example where we passed it a JavaScript object, right? And we went and set a concrete property and one derived from a data element, okay? But we can also go and do something like this. Inside of our data, we can go and define things as basically JavaScript objects, and then we can pass it in an array of those JavaScript objects to go and show those styles, okay? But what we typically prefer to do, to be honest with you, is we don't typically like to do this or even do this as needed, right? What we prefer to do is actually just have our styles inside of the CSS, okay? So it's useful to be able to manipulate the CSS dynamically for coding reasons, right? Say you need to show or hide something or whatever. But we use that as little as possible. We want our real, quote-unquote, real CSS or styles to be as plain CSS. Or if you like using Sass, you can use Sass or Stylus or whatever your favorite CSS processing framework is. All those things, for example, you can hook Sass into Vue without any issues, right? It's just all the tooling is available to use those libraries. But we typically like to have those in one place. And actually, let me open up another project real quick. Which project do I want to open up? I have a bunch of different Vue projects in here, so I just need to pick one. Actually, I may already have it open. Nope. Let me open up a... a lot of projects, huh? All right, let's just do this. Sorry, I'm also going to show you a framework that you can layer on top of Vue called Nuxt, which is really nice. So let's go and drop to the command line here. Okay. So this is a website I built for a friend recently, and it's using a framework called Nuxt, but let's have a quick look around this. Okay, there's our thing. Okay. And, okay, so what I want to show here is that in this case, I'm using Stylus, and specifically the Vuetify library. We can have a look at this in a little bit more detail if we have some time. But you can see I have my styles defined inside of here. And what happens is these styles will get inherited into my different templates. So when I use a style here, right, so you can see I have a class here called underline, and that's within this Vue component over here. And hopefully, yes, there it is. So here's my underline style. But the point here is that like typical HTML or website development, you keep all of your base styles over here in like a styles.css, or in this case, I'm using Stylus. And they can get inherited into all of your Vue components. So you can keep your base styles over here, and if a specific component needs styling just for that component, you can go and use the styles segment of that Vue component. But typically, we like to do, most people like to just have everything in styles.css and just use straight CSS rather than having a lot of styling declarations inside of components, right? All right. Let's make sure we covered everything. We only have a few minutes, right? Right, so don't use style. Talked about this already. We can do that binding. We prefer to do it in CSS. And then we just go and declare the class, et cetera, et cetera. Let's talk about expressions a little bit. So expressions are something that you can run inside of a Vue template, right? So we've already seen a few expressions. Show logo equals true, and Vdash if 5 is greater than 3, et cetera, right? And we have access to a couple of different things in those expressions, but I don't want to go too much into that. I want to talk about forms a little bit, make sure we've covered everything. Two-way data binding, Vdash model, track value input model. We listen for the, Vue listens for the inputs and can update the model, two-way data binding. You're all familiar with that stuff, so we will go and skip over this. Some modifiers that we have with forms, these are super useful. So we can say trim, this thing has to be a number, or do lazy evaluation of what is in that specific input field, right? So this is nice. If you need to trim white space, you put .trim. If it's a number, Vue will make sure that only a number can be entered in there, et cetera, right? So that's less code we have to write. And we can do modifier chaining. So we could say for this specific model element, go and do lazy invocation of events for that thing, and also trim it. Okay, so we can do modifier chaining. Quickly make sure we cover everything around event handling, map standard DOM events. We can also pass params, right? So we saw this earlier where we did a Vdash on click with our toggle logo. We talked about conditionals already. Okay, and then there's this Vdash show. We looked at loops already, right? And this is a more sophisticated, or I should say a more complete example of doing a loop. You can have the value, key, and index. So if you ever use something like _JS, where you have the _.each, right? Sometimes having not just the value, but the key and the index is useful when you're building something out. We looked at some of the things for events already. We talked about click.prevent. We can also have other modifiers, for example, self, make sure something can only be clicked once, right? And we can also go and hook into specific keyed events, right? So we can say, key up on enter, go and do something, and these are nominally the different types of keys that you can go and listen for. Enter, tab, delete, escape, space, et cetera, right? We can also go and hit mouse events, so we can say mouse down right, go and do this. And there's actually something special, for example, here, context menu.prevent. Prevent basically means don't propagate the mouse click, but we can actually hook directly into the context menu by doing Vdash on context menu, go and invoke this function when someone right-clicks. Right? We looked at networking, promise.library. library. I use a lot of serverless cloud functions because it works really well for building lightweight applications. And we have a few more minutes. And things that we didn't talk about are watchers and computed, that should say computed property, my apologies, not computer properties. So computed properties are interesting because what that allows you to do is, again, it's another optimization that we can make. Right? A computed property is something that we can go and have computed in terms of some kind of data, but we don't want that thing to be calculated every time we need it. So you can think of a computed property as something that runs. We have that property available now to us, right? It could be something that we compute in doing some math or whatever. Maybe we build a template, sub-template or whatever. But the idea behind the computed property is that it's essentially cached. So you can go and fetch that property over and over again without actually doing any work. You're just basically getting the cached version of what is in that computed property. Okay, so that's useful for performance optimizations. We didn't talk about filters, but this is what a filter looks like, for example. All right? So we can say we have a result, invoke the remove space method, and then invoke the title case method to go and format that thing. Right? And so this is something that we can go, and the remove space and title case are filters. They're just methods that we have access to go and manipulate or change the way something looks or whatever we need to do. Okay? We looked a little bit at components, not too much. Components are relatively straightforward, as we saw. I gave the quick example of using router. And when you get more sophisticated, right, we talked so far about base view, and we talked about view router. When you're building a complex application that has a lot of data, that is probably a good time to make the jump to using Vuex for state management. Okay? And this is being recorded, so I can't go and talk about what I really think about React and Angular state management. But let me just say that Vuex, I find to be much simpler than using the tooling that's available in the React and the Angular world. It just makes more intuitive and it makes more sense to me. Okay? And it's really easy to get started with. Anyways, Vuex is what you would go use for state management. And again, it doesn't implement the one-way data flow. Vue is not a one-way data flow type of an architecture like React is. It uses two-way data binding, so Vuex works with that really nicely. Right? We looked at routing briefly. The other thing that I want to spend at least a minute on, right? I have 1 minute, right? 1 minute, okay. So I found, you're going to be surprised at this. I found that if you make people late for lunch, you get really bad reviews. I don't know why that is, right? So. Right, so server-side rendering. When I build out a Vue application, I actually use a library layered on top of that called Nuxt, N-U-X-T. And you don't need to use Nuxt to do this, but Nuxt provides a lot of things to make your development velocity go even faster. But one of the key things that it provides is the ability to do server-side rendering. Right? So when I publish a Vue application up onto my server, I'm not running like something like basically a node process that is going and like serving the files and like doing server-side rendering. What I actually do is I do a full static generation of my Vue application so that when the user comes to my website, the application is already bootstrapped. So it loads up instantly and starts immediately. There's no delay. You know, a lot of times when you go to a website, especially if it's like a slightly complex website, there'll be like a little spinner that spins for a second or two while Angular or React or whatever library is initializing, and then you see the content. With server-side rendering, you get the immediacy of a pre-rendered Vue application that shows immediately and starts immediately in the web browser. Okay? All right, and with that, I'm exactly on time, so I'm going to stop. Thank you for coming. If you have any questions, I'll be here the rest of the day. You can drop by the IBM booth, and we can have a chat. Thanks, everybody.